The cameras were already rolling when Jasmine Crockett walked into the hearing room, but no one was paying attention yet. Not really. They were still pretending this was just another day, another panel, another stack of paper, another performance dressed up as accountability. Brett Kavanaugh sat behind the polished oak table, posture rigid, jaw set like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He'd faced questions before. He'd survived them, too. But today wasn't like the others. Today, someone walked in who didn't come to play the part. Jasmine set her leather folder down so quietly it almost looked polite. But there was something in her eyes, some cold clarity, that made even the aides stop shuffling their papers. For a moment, the hum of the cameras faded. The only sound was her chair sliding into place. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, probably to fill the silence before it swallowed him whole. And Jasmine smiled. Not wide. Not warm. The kind of smile that said, "I already know how this ends." When the chairman introduced her, you could almost hear the air contract. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." Her voice was low. Even. Almost gentle. "Thank you." She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at Kavanaugh, her gaze so steady it made him glance down for a second, a flicker most people would have missed. But not her. She began without preamble. "You've said repeatedly," she began, "that the court must maintain credibility above all else." He nodded, expression locked in that careful neutrality he wore like armor. "And yet," she continued, flipping open the folder, "you have consistently failed to disclose relationships, financial entanglements, and political affiliations that would compromise any other judge in this country." A low murmur rippled along the benches. Kavanaugh opened his mouth to interrupt. But she didn't pause. "This isn't a debate, Justice. It's a reckoning." She laid the first document on the table between them, her fingertip tapping the date at the top. September 12, 2019. A private meeting with a donor whose case came before your court 6 weeks later. His jaw flexed, a single tick of annoyance. October 3, 2020. An undisclosed flight on a private jet, paid for by an organization with active litigation. She dropped the next paper. And the next. And the next. The pile grew. The tension grew with it. In the gallery, a journalist mouthed, "Holy sh**t." And Jasmine still hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence was louder than any accusation. For a few breaths, no one moved. Even the cameras, perched on their tripods, seemed to be holding still, like they knew something irreversible had just begun. Kavanaugh shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the glass of water he hadn't touched. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her palms resting lightly on the folder now half empty on the table. "You see," she said, her tone almost conversational, "this is why people don't trust this institution anymore." Her voice was calm, but every syllable hit the air like a blade. Because while ordinary Americans are getting eviction notices, sitting on hold for hours just to beg for a hearing. She gestured to the stack of papers. "You are flying to private retreats and accepting gifts you don't even bother to mention on your disclosure forms." Someone in the back coughed, the sound too sharp to be casual. Kavanaugh tried to lift his chin, to reassert that calm, judicial distance. But his voice came out thinner than he meant. "With respect, Congresswoman, these are not." "Not what?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Not relevant?" Her eyebrow arched, just enough to say, "Try me." "Not factual?" She tapped the last document, the final page she'd brought. "Then explain this one." He didn't look at the page. "This is a list," she said, "of 37 cases, 37, heard in your courtroom involving corporations you either invested in or received benefits from. Cases where you failed to recuse yourself." The word "failed" didn't echo. It thundered. A staffer's pen slipped from his hand, clattering against the marble floor. Kavanaugh swallowed hard, the mic picking up the tiny click in his throat. He started to speak again. But Jasmine's eyes locked onto his with a steadiness that made the entire room feel smaller. "When you told the American people that you would be impartial," she said softly, "did you really believe it?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It landed so heavy that for a moment even he seemed unsure how to answer. And in that second, something shifted. The image, the myth, of the untouchable justice began to crack. She let the silence stretch, let the watchers at home and the reporters in the back process the spectacle of a Supreme Court justice cornered not by shouting but by facts. Because this wasn't performance. It was exposure. And no one watching, on TV or in that vaulted chamber, could look away. Jasmine slowly reached for the last sheet of paper, but she didn't place it on the pile. Instead, she held it up. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is the contract for your speaking engagement with the very same donor whose case you ruled on. A contract you never disclosed." A low, stunned gasp rippled through the gallery. Her gaze didn't waver. "No more illusions," she said quietly. Her thumb tapped the paper once. "No more excuses." She set it down, so gentle it was almost an act of mercy. Then she folded her hands and simply waited. And for the first time in a very long career, Brett Kavanaugh looked like a man who had nowhere left to hide. The gallery was so quiet you could hear the faint mechanical hum of the recording equipment. Kavanaugh's eyes dropped to the stack of papers, 37 cases, a signed contract, a pattern no prepared statement could dissolve. But Jasmine wasn't done. She folded her hands on the table, her expression almost serene. "You know," she began, her voice lower now, "when I was a public defender in Texas, I watched judges lecture my clients about personal responsibility. A few reporters shifted, pens poised. About how their choices had consequences. Her gaze didn't leave Kavanaugh's. About how no amount of excuses could erase what was done." He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself behind that mask of institutional authority. But Jasmine kept going, her tone deceptively soft. "Funny how those lectures never seem to apply to men who sit where you sit." The chairman looked like he wanted to interrupt, wanted to bring the decorum back into the room, but even he didn't dare. Because this wasn't grandstanding. It was something rarer, truth delivered without apology. Jasmine lifted the final document and slid it across the table. "This is your financial disclosure form from 2018, she said, her fingertip resting on the signature line. "It's missing over $200,000 in gifts and travel." Kavanaugh's lips parted, but no words came out. "And before you claim clerical error," she continued, her tone as steady as a surgeon's hand, "you should know we cross-referenced it with multiple records." Her voice dropped even lower. "Nothing about this is speculative." The silence was total. It wasn't the hush of respect, it was the hush of recognition. Recognition that something had broken open and couldn't be closed again. She sat back. "When the American people hear you talk about fairness," she said, her eyes never blinking, "what do you suppose they're supposed to feel?" He swallowed again. "You want to talk about credibility," she went on, "about public trust, about the dignity of your office." Her voice hardened just enough to make the hairs on the back of every neck in the room rise. "Then start by owning the fact that you abused it." She gestured at the pile between them. "These are facts. Not accusations. Not rumors. Not partisan spin. Facts." A camera light shifted, landing directly on Kavanaugh's face. And for a moment, he looked less like a justice and more like any other man who realized too late that his story was about to collapse. Jasmine leaned forward just enough to make sure he couldn't look away. "You've had years to come clean," she said, her voice quiet. Her next words were softer still, but they carried more force than any shouted indictment. "And you chose not to." A murmur moved through the gallery, a kind of collective exhale. Some people looked stunned. Others just nodded, like they'd been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because every single person watching knew what they had just seen. No more illusions. No more excuses. And no more safe places to hide. Kavanaugh's hand hovered over the microphone like he might turn it off, like he might wish, for just a moment, that he could shut down the entire broadcast. But there was no shutting this down. Not today. Jasmine let the silence do what it does best, force everyone to look at what they'd been pretending not to see. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too calm. "I want to ask you something," she began. Her words were deliberate, each one landing with surgical precision. "Do you believe that justice belongs to everyone?" His throat moved. "Yes," he managed. She didn't react. "Do you believe that judges have a higher responsibility to be transparent?" "Yes." Her expression didn't flicker. "Then help me understand," she said, her tone like cold water, "why your version of transparency leaves so many blanks." He swallowed again, but she wasn't finished. "When a single mother in Detroit forgets to report income, she loses her benefits." Her voice didn't rise, but something in it turned sharper. "When a young man in Houston fails to disclose a prior charge, he goes to prison." The gallery was dead silent. "But when you fail to disclose 6 figures in gifts from political donors," she continued, "we're told it's an oversight." Her gaze locked onto him. "That's not an oversight." Her hand tapped the folder. "That's entitlement." A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with how naked the truth sounded when it wasn't wrapped in legal jargon. Kavanaugh's jaw tightened. "Congresswoman." "No." The interruption was so soft, it was more powerful than a shout. "No," she repeated, voice steady. "You don't get to talk about the dignity of this court while hiding behind paperwork you never intended for the public to see." He pressed his lips together, the mask slipping further. "I watched your confirmation hearing," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "You told this country that you were committed to integrity." Her next words were quiet. "You told my constituents to trust you." A few camera flashes went off, capturing the moment. Jasmine Crockett, unflinching. Brett Kavanaugh, unable to look her in the eye. She didn't flinch. "Tell them why you didn't earn that trust," she said. He didn't answer. And that silence, that ragged, undeniable silence, said more than any denial ever could. She picked up the final document and held it lightly in her hands. "This is the last piece," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "It's a record of the times you recused yourself." She glanced down. "And all the times you didn't." Another hush swept the room. Because no one could pretend anymore. No one could hide behind illusions or excuses. And Jasmine was going to make sure the entire country knew it. The chairman shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat like he might intervene. But he didn't. No one did. Because Jasmine wasn't just questioning a Supreme Court justice, she was pulling back the curtain on an entire system. She laid the final sheet on the pile. "It's all here," she said, her voice quiet. "Every recusal you should have filed." Her fingertip tapped the dates, each one a reminder, each one a failure to step aside when any other judge would have been forced to. Kavanaugh finally looked up, and for the first time since she began, his voice cracked around the edges. "Congresswoman, you are mischaracterizing." "No," she said, not raising her tone but slicing through his defense with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. "I'm clarifying." Another camera flash burst across the table, illuminating the lines around his eyes, the taut set of his mouth. "You don't get to call it an error when it's a pattern," Jasmine said. Her voice lowered, drawing everyone in. "And you don't get to call it public service when it's self-enrichment." He opened his mouth, closed it again. "This is not about your politics," she continued, her gaze steady, "or your ideology, Or the years you've spent building a reputation? She shifted in her chair, leaning forward so he had nowhere else to look. It's about power. The word hung in the air, heavy as a verdict. You have it, she said. Her hand lifted, gesturing to the gallery, the cameras, the seal on the wall behind his chair. And they don't. Kavanaugh blinked once, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. So when you tell this country to trust you, she continued, her voice softer now, softer and somehow more devastating, you are asking them to believe that you can be trusted with power you've already shown you can't wield without bias. A young man in the second row shifted in his seat, his eyes wide, his hand covering his mouth. This isn't a courtroom, Jasmine said, her tone still measured, but it is a record. She tapped the stack of papers one final time. And I want your answer on that record. Kavanaugh drew in a slow breath, his gaze darting to the chairman, to the counsel on his right, to the ceiling as if searching for an escape. There is nothing further to add, he said, voice tight. Jasmine didn't smile. She nodded once, like a teacher acknowledging a student's incomplete answer. Then let the American people decide what that silence means. The hush that followed was total, broken only by the click of a camera lens and the ragged exhale of a reporter in the back row. For a moment, just one. The myth of Brett Kavanaugh seemed to shrink into something small enough to fit under her fingertip. And everyone watching knew it. When the chairman finally spoke, his voice sounded thin, like he knew any interruption would look like surrender. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, I think we. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even turn her head. She just kept her eyes on Kavanaugh. I'm not finished. The chairman's mouth shut, the words dying before they could take shape. Jasmine rested her hand over the stack of papers she'd built piece by piece, each one a brick in the case she wasn't going to let him walk away from. You know, she said, her tone softening in a way that made it somehow even harder to look away, I remember exactly where I was when you were confirmed. Kavanaugh's gaze lifted warily. I was in my district, she went on, sitting with a group of women who had survived sexual assault. The room seemed to contract around her words. They watched you raise your right hand and swear that you would be impartial. That you would be honest. That you would protect the credibility of this court. Her voice stayed level, but her eyes were brighter now, and she didn't blink. And I sat there wondering if any of them believed you. A woman in the gallery exhaled shakily, her hands folded so tight in her lap they looked white. I wanted to believe you, Jasmine admitted, her voice lower. Because this country needs to believe that even the most powerful people can be held to a standard. Her hand lifted, palm open, almost pleading. But you made that impossible. Kavanaugh looked away. And for a moment, he didn't look like a Supreme Court justice. He looked like any other man trying to find a place to hide from the truth. Jasmine let her hand fall. You don't get to lecture this country about law and order when you can't even follow your own rules, she said. Her words weren't angry. They were tired. Tired of the performance. Tired of the excuses. Tired of pretending that power automatically deserves respect. When you talk about integrity, she continued, I want you to remember this moment. She gestured to the cameras. To remember that millions of people are watching. Her eyes locked on his. And they're not watching because they believe you. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They're watching because they don't. A long, pulsing silence followed. Somewhere in the back, a reporter typed the quote before she'd even finished speaking. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, but the sound was small. Congresswoman. But she was already gathering her papers, as if to say the discussion was over. Because in every way that mattered, it was. She looked up one last time. When the history of this era is written, she said, her voice quiet but clear, your name will be there. She paused. But so will mine. And with that, she stood. No theatrics. No applause. Just the quiet certainty of someone who knew she had told the truth, and made sure the world heard it. Kavanaugh stayed seated, staring down at the polished wood of the table like it might offer him an answer he hadn't prepared. But there was no answer. Not anymore. Jasmine didn't leave her seat just yet. She waited, letting the moment breathe. Letting everyone watching feel the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Because this wasn't just about one man's record. It was about the quiet violence of a system that protected people like him. She looked to her left, to the young intern clutching a notepad and shaking hands, her eyes wide with something between awe and relief. And for a flicker of a second, Jasmine thought about every person who had ever been told to lower their voice, to mind their tone, to respect the institution more than they respected their own truth. No more. Slowly, she turned back to Kavanaugh. "You've built a career on the idea that your word is beyond reproach," she said. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was almost sad. But what good is a reputation if it can't survive the light? He didn't answer. "Let me tell you something about my constituents," she continued, her voice steady. "They don't expect perfection." A long pause. "But they expect honesty." She lifted the last folder in her stack, the final document she had saved for this exact moment. And when she spoke again, the words were soft, but the impact was seismic. "This is a letter," she said, "from a retired federal judge. A man who served longer than you've been alive." Her eyes didn't waver. "He read your decisions. He read the reports." Jasmine laid the letter gently on the table between them. "And he wrote that in all his years on the bench, he had never seen such a brazen disregard for disclosure." The quote rippled through the gallery, a low current of disbelief. Kavanaugh's jaw worked, but no words came out. Jasmine tapped the letter once with her fingertip. "This is how history will remember you," she said quietly. She glanced at the cameras again, her gaze steady as iron. Not as a man who protected the court. She leaned forward just slightly. But as a man who hid behind it. Someone in the back row gasped. The chairman shifted again, looking everywhere but at Jasmine. Because nobody wanted to be the one to interrupt her now. Her voice stayed low. "You can call this political if it makes you feel better," she said. "But the truth is bigger than politics." She folded her hands on the table, her shoulders level. "The truth is that you knew exactly what you were doing." Kavanaugh swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on a spot just over her shoulder. "And you did it anyway," she finished. For a beat, the room was as silent as a confession. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, and the entire gallery rose with her. Reporters. Aides. Observers. They didn't applaud. They just stood. Because sometimes, you don't clap for the truth. Sometimes, you just witness it. As Jasmine turned to leave, she caught the eye of a woman standing near the exit, a young mother with a press badge clipped to her collar and exhaustion written into the lines of her face. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Jasmine thought of every person who would see this clip, not as a spectacle, but as validation that someone, somewhere, was finally willing to say it. She paused with her hand resting on the back of her chair. And then, because she knew the record had to be complete, she spoke one more time. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice clear as glass. "It's about everyone who's ever sat in a courtroom believing the deck was stacked before they even opened their mouth." Kavanaugh closed his eyes. Jasmine didn't look away. "You called it law," she said. Her voice was softer now, almost gentle. "I call it something else." For the first time, she let a sliver of sadness into her expression. "Yours is not the only name in that file," she continued, tapping the pile of documents one last time. "There are more." The reporters were scribbling furiously, their pens scratching out the lines that would headline every broadcast before the day was over. "But we start with you," Jasmine said. "Because you are supposed to be the example." Kavanaugh's jaw tightened again, but he didn't try to respond. he couldn't. She straightened her spine, the tension draining from her shoulders but leaving her voice steady as a judge's gavel. "I want the people watching to understand something," she said, turning to the cameras. "This is not an isolated incident." Her hand lifted in a slow, quiet gesture that took in the whole hearing room, the whole system. "This is what happens when power stops believing it should answer to the rest of us." A beat of stillness. "This is what happens when accountability becomes optional." She looked back at Kavanaugh one final time. "And that is why I will not sit down." The chairman cleared his throat again, voice brittle. "Congresswoman Crockett." She turned to him, her tone calm but implacable. "I'm done." It was not an admission of defeat. It was a declaration that she had said everything that needed saying, and that no one could unhear it. As she stepped back, reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping. "Congresswoman, do you believe he should resign? Was this personal? Do you fear retribution?" Jasmine didn't answer any of them. She simply walked past the cameras and through the double doors, leaving a hush that felt heavier than applause. Outside, the air was brisk, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the Capitol steps. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, messages from colleagues, supporters, strangers she would never meet. But she didn't look at them yet. Instead, she paused on the top step and let herself exhale. Because this was bigger than any headline. This was the moment a lie ran out of places to hide. And Jasmine Crockett made sure the whole country saw it. Inside, the hearing room remained frozen in a stunned kind of quiet. Kavanaugh hadn't moved. The chairman looked like he wanted to call a recess but couldn't find his voice. And the rest of the committee members just sat there, shifting in their seats, suddenly aware that they were all part of a moment they would never be able to deny. Jasmine's chair sat empty at the witness table, but somehow, her presence still filled the room. Because the truth has a way of staying behind long after the person who spoke it has left. A reporter finally broke the silence, her voice low but urgent. "Justice Kavanaugh, do you have any response?" He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and looked straight ahead. "No comment." The words landed with a dull finality that no statement could soften. And for everyone watching live, on televisions in airports, phones in waiting rooms, laptops balanced on kitchen counters, it was clear. He had nothing left to say. Outside, Jasmine descended the Capitol steps slowly, each movement deliberate. Not triumphant. Just certain. Reporters were waiting at the bottom, their cameras already rolling. But she didn't rush. She paused, letting them fill the space with their shouted questions. "Congresswoman Crockett. Did you plan this confrontation? Do you believe the Supreme Court is corrupt? Will you introduce articles of impeachment?" She stopped just short of the microphones. And she waited. The noise began to fade, curiosity burning so bright it swallowed the chaos. When she finally spoke, her words were low and measured, but every syllable carried. "This isn't about me," she said again, her voice almost calm. "It's about whether we still expect truth from people in power." A hush rippled over the crowd. "If you can't trust the highest court in the country to be honest," she continued, her gaze level, "where does that leave the rest of us?" A young man in the front row swallowed hard, his phone trembling slightly in his hand. Jasmine's eyes met his for half a second. "You deserve better," she said softly. And for a moment, it didn't feel like she was speaking to the cameras or the reporters. It felt like she was speaking to every person who'd ever wondered if the system was rigged before they even had a chance to stand up. She stepped back, her shoulders square. "Ask yourselves why the people in that room couldn't answer a single question," she said. "Ask yourselves why the truth makes them so nervous." Someone called out, "Congresswoman, will there be consequences?" She paused, letting the silence gather around her again. "There already are," she said simply. And with that, she turned and walked toward the waiting car, the microphone still reaching for her voice, the cameras still rolling, trying to capture what couldn't be spun or reframed. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout. It's to say the quiet part out loud, and then walk away while the echoes do the rest. Jasmine Crockett didn't look back as the doors of the car closed behind her. Inside, the air was still, the chaos muffled by thick glass. She leaned back against the seat, her hand resting lightly on the folder in her lap, the same folder she'd carried into the hearing, the one that now felt almost weightless. Her phone vibrated over and over with calls and texts, reporters demanding comment, colleagues offering private applause, strangers pouring out stories she knew by heart because she'd lived her own version of them. She didn't answer any of it. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes. And she thought about her mother. About the first time she'd watched her mother stand in front of a landlord who tried to cheat her out of a deposit. The way her mother's voice hadn't cracked, even when she was scared. That was the first time Jasmine understood that courage doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a woman calmly refusing to let the lie stand. The car pulled away from the Capitol, rolling past tourists with cameras and students on field trips who would grow up learning the names of the men in that building, but maybe now, they'd learn the names of the women who stood up to them too. As the skyline receded, Jasmine finally looked at her phone. One message caught her eye. It was from a public defender in Chicago. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for all of us who've been told to sit down. Jasmine swallowed, her throat tight. Because that was the point. This wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about going viral. It was about making sure that the people who felt invisible understood that somebody saw them, and wasn't afraid to say so in the loudest room in the country. She tucked the phone away. Outside the window, the city blurred past, monuments and barricades and centuries of stories, some told, some buried. But one truth stayed with her, steady as her own heartbeat. Power doesn't belong to the people who try to hoard it. It belongs to the ones willing to speak when it matters most. And as long as she had breath, Jasmine Crockett intended to keep speaking. Because history doesn't just record the polite moments. It records the ruptures, the times when somebody finally said what everyone else was too afraid to admit. When the car slowed at a red light, Jasmine looked out across the wide avenue. A little girl in braids stood holding her mother's hand, watching the car with bright, unblinking eyes. Jasmine met her gaze. And she smiled. Because maybe that little girl would grow up believing that truth didn't belong only to the powerful. It belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. And maybe, just maybe, she'd remember this day, not because a congresswoman made headlines, but because she proved that the truth could still win. Even here. Especially here. When a system depends on your silence, your voice becomes your greatest act of defiance. Today wasn't just about Brett Kavanaugh. It wasn't just about a courtroom or a stack of documents. It was about showing that no title, no robe, can place someone beyond accountability. It was about every person who has ever sat in a room, knowing the odds were rigged, and chose to speak anyway. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. She let the truth do the heavy lifting. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Power is loud. But truth is louder. So if this story struck something in you, if it made you feel seen or made you think twice about the systems we're told to trust without question, share it. Because silence protects the powerful. But stories like this? They protect the rest of us. And this isn't the end. It's just the beginning.